You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 378, recorded on May 30th, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Idaho, as always, is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill. So for today's episode, we are taking another look back at the events that happened 100 years ago in 1921. The Tulsa Race Massacre, or the bombing of Black Wall Street, occurred on May 31st, 1921. Today, we are going to focus on the economic conditions of Black Wall Street and the unique position that Black people in Oklahoma held in contrast to Black communities in other former slaveholding states. So just an introduction to what this event was. I am taking a lot of this narrative from an arsenalfordemocracy.com essay written by Deanna Jones in February 2015. Titled Black Wall Street, We Did It By Ourselves and Were Punished. So the bombing of Black Wall Street, otherwise known as the Tulsa Race Riot, is a textbook example of the results of white discomfort with Black success. In the early 1900s, the city of Tulsa began to grow at a rapid pace, and by 1921, just after the First World War, the city was already going through its second oil boom. So there was a lot of wealth accumulated in the city of Tulsa. In the city of Tulsa, there was a Black neighborhood called Greenwood, and they were flourishing and had become a center of Black affluence, earning it the name Black Wall Street. On May 31st, 1921, a white mob descended on Greenwood, destroying 1,000 homes and many businesses, displacing most of the district's 10,000 residents. By the next morning, on June 1st, Greenwood had been burned almost to the ground, and up to 300 people were killed, although we'll never really know the actual number, just because there was a lot of hiding of evidence. Bodies were just dumped in the river, so there's no way to get a true account of how many people were actually murdered. Residents even reported that planes had gone over the neighborhood and dropped crude bombs on businesses and residential buildings. And as a side note, this will not be the last time this year that we discuss the centennial of people in the U.S. getting bombarded from private aircraft, as this was repeated in the Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia later in 1921. Troops were deployed to try to restore order in Greenwood, but it was too late. The destruction left many of the residents homeless and living in tents for almost a year. There's a lot of speculation on what the actual motivation behind the attack was. Although it was initially stated that it was because of an alleged and later dismissed attack of a young white woman, there was already high racial tension before then. White residents' membership in the Ku Klux Klan had grown rapidly in the few years before the attack, and many of the white people in the Tulsa neighborhoods just outside of Greenwood were poor. So seeing the neighborhood just next door doing so well probably made the already existing tension even worse, and that just boiled over on this evening of May 31st. There is an official history from the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum website, and I'm going to quote from that now. In the early morning hours of June 1st, 1921, Greenwood was looted and burned by white rioters. Governor Robertson declared martial law, and National Guard troops arrived in Tulsa. Guardsmen assisted firemen in putting out fires, took African Americans out of the hands of vigilantes, and imprisoned all Black Tulsans not already interned. Over 6,000 people were held at the convention hall in the fairgrounds, some for as long as 8 days. 24 hours after the violence erupted, it ceased. In the wake of the violence, 35 city blocks lay in charred ruins, more than 800 people were treated for injuries, and contemporary reports of deaths began at 36. Historians now believe as many as 300 people may have died. And from the official Race Riot Commission report of 2001 for the 80th anniversary review of this event, public officials provided firearms and ammunition to individuals, all of them white. Units of the Oklahoma National Guard participated in the mass arrests of all or nearly all of Greenwood's residents. And designating it as a riot prevented insurance companies from having to pay benefits to the people of Greenwood whose homes and businesses were destroyed. It also was common at the time for any large-scale clash between different racial or ethnic groups to be categorized as a race riot. As we'll talk about later, the residents of Greenwood didn't get made whole in any way. There were no reparations, there were no damages awarded at this time. And we'll discuss that a little more in depth, what that means even today. Now to go back a little bit to the rise of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and where the wealth came from. In 1905, in November of 1905, an oil speculator named Robert Galbraith, drilling on land owned by Ida Glenn, who was a Creek native, and her husband Robert, drilled and found a gusher. This discovery brought oil production into the state of Oklahoma and made Tulsa the capital of oil in Oklahoma and the world. Because Creek natives owned land in this area, many Creek land allotment owners became millionaires. This boom, which propelled Oklahoma to the top of global oil production for some time, followed smaller, earlier turn-of-the-century booms in the area around the recently incorporated town of Tulsa. Some prominent oil fortunes, like the Getty family, originate in the first few years of the 20th century in Tulsa's oil fields, even if bigger booms in California or Saudi Arabia really made it big. As in the Pennsylvania oil rush of the mid-19th century, oil towns like Tulsa became critical for short-term storage of crude oil before transportation to refineries and then to the rest of the world, as well as a place for oil workers to live and merchants to supply equipment. Tulsa and neighboring Red Fork already had rail access due to the cattle grazing industry before statehood, which made it convenient and quick to promote an oil industry as soon as the gushers were located. Statehood was not far behind striking oil. So, Bill, do you want to discuss the formation of the state of Oklahoma?
Yes. So, as Rachel noted earlier, there's a lot of unusual characteristics around Oklahoma compared to other parts of the country, and those are important for us to understand the rise and then fall of the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa. So, as you may recall, when the Trail of Tears happened in the early 19th century, the area that is now the state of Oklahoma was set aside initially by the federal government as various locations for the so-called civilized tribes of the southeastern United States to be relocated to by force. And initially, the idea was this was just going to be this designated sort of zone of this huge territory that was just going to be for the indigenous people. And of course, unsurprisingly, that did not end up lasting through the various events of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And the Oklahoma was one of the later states to become a state as opposed to a territory. So let's talk about the statehood that was achieved in 1907. So from 1902 to 1905, and this is again during the period of this early oil exploration and then this boom, 5 major indigenous nations in present-day eastern Oklahoma, including Tulsa and the oil fields, then known as Indian Territory, unsuccessfully proposed to Congress through the normal statehood procedures the creation of a majority indigenous state called Sequoia, named for the early 19th century Cherokee figure. It would have had a fairly significant black minority population as well, for reasons that we're about to talk about. When this proposal was rejected by the federal government, the fallback option for the indigenous governments in the territory was to take a leadership role in an application for the entirety of what is now Oklahoma to become a state. Now, there was another oil boom around Tulsa in 1915, shortly before the U.S. entry into World War I, which lasted into the Depression era. And that's what Rachel was alluding to earlier when quoting the essay, essentially noting that there had been 2 of the world's largest oil booms in the years running up to the events of 1921 in Greenwood. So we need to talk now about the Greenwood neighborhood and its rise. And by the time we get to 1920, there were about 14% of the Tulsa population, or 10,000 black residents, were African American. And the rest of the population was basically either white or indigenous. But how did that get there? Well, the federal government after Reconstruction had officially abandoned Civil War era plans to provide land grants to freed slaves in the slave states. And this had possibly included considering resettling them in unused areas of what is today central Oklahoma. These had been set aside for indigenous people, but the indigenous communities had not yet used them or assigned them to anybody. And so this was, for a while, this was considered as a possible location for resettling freed slaves. However, the slaves who were freed after the Civil War in the indigenous nations within modern-day Oklahoma were given land grants. And this was partially due to a federal policy choice to punish some tribal governments that had supported the Confederacy's rebellion. And these African Americans were the so-called tribal freedmen, as opposed to the general freedmen population. And the general freedmen population, as everyone pretty much knows, received very little assistance or restitution after slavery. But the land grants to the tribal freedmen in the indigenous nations in Indian Territory, or today's eastern Oklahoma, these land grants translated to a substantial pocket of black wealth accumulation over a period of half a century. Having made some initial money from farming or cattle grazing, some of these individuals transitioned that startup capital into business, especially after the oil boom started around 1905 and Tulsa began expanding rapidly. Both farming and commercial activities attracted other freedmen to the area from the rest of the U.S. too, even before the oil, and that migration only surged after the oil boom. Now, I want to quote here from an article on the History Channel website, which is a new article that's promoting their upcoming documentary this weekend on the events of 1921. Quote, as word spread that Indian Territory was a safe place for African Americans to settle, between 1865 and 1920, more than 50 black townships were founded in Oklahoma. So there's another important factor here that we need to look at, which is which lands were granted to these freed black former slaves, either the people who were moving there from other parts of the country or the people who were actually granted them directly after the Civil War out of the Indian Territory itself. Many of the black land grants in Indian Territory were remote and poor agricultural lands. Basically, they just thought, okay, if we have to give them land, then we'll give them the worst land. But these actually sat on top of enormous undiscovered oil reserves. The oil booms after 1900 and the leasing arrangements for production, or alternatively outright land sales to oil companies, meant that some black landowners cashed in big, at least relative to the median black American at the time, and in some cases even comparably to white fortunes. There's a great new article in the Associated Press this month that focuses specifically on what they refer to as the, quote, seed money for Greenwood, or the Black Wall Street boom in Tulsa. So I want to quote from that article. Unlike black Americans across the country after slavery, Williams' ancestors and thousands of other black members of slave-owning Native American nations freed after the war, quote, had land, says Williams, a Tulsa community activist. Quote, they had opportunity to build a house on that land, farm that land, and they were wealthy with their crops. And that was huge, a great opportunity, and you're thinking this is going to last for generations to come. I can leave my children this land, and they can leave their children this land, recounts Williams, whose ancestor went from enslaved laborer to judge of the Muskogee Creek Tribal Supreme Court after slavery. In fact, Elena E. Roberts, an assistant professor of University of Pittsburgh, writes in her book, I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land, the freed slaves of 5 Native American nations, quote, became the only people of African descent in the world to receive what might be viewed as reparations for their enslavement on a large scale. Why that happened in the territory that became Oklahoma and not the rest of the slaveholding South is that the U.S. government enforced stricter terms for Reconstruction on the slave-owning American Indian nations that had partially or fully allied with the Confederacy than it had on the southern states themselves. By 1860, about 14% of the population of that tribal territory of the future state of Oklahoma were black people enslaved by tribal members. After the Civil War, the black tribal freedmen held millions of acres in common with other tribal members and later in large individual allotments. The difference that made is incalculable, Roberts said in an interview. Allotments really gave them an upward mobility that other black people did not have in most of the United States. The financial stability allowed black Native American freedmen to start businesses, farms, and ranches, and helped give rise to Black Wall Street and thriving black communities in the future state of Oklahoma. The prosperity of those communities, many long since vanished, attracted black African Americans from the South, built them up as a black mecca, Roberts says. Black Wall Street alone had roughly 200 businesses. So that explains the seed money that got this Greenwood neighborhood off the ground at the beginning of the Tulsa oil boom. But what happened subsequently to that? Well, explicit racial segregation zoning ordinances in Tulsa increasingly channeled black customers to black businesses, keeping black community spending within the black community, circulating that money repeatedly. And there was a really fascinating article from Investopedia.com, which normally you wouldn't expect to have an essay like this, but for whatever reason, they had a historian, economic historian, who has a specific focus on this, the events of 1921 in Tulsa, write an essay on this. Quote, as segregation grew stronger, Greenwood's black business district thrived, mainly because residents fed their purchasing dollars back into the local economy while earning their incomes from white employers. This was possible because the migration of oil men to Tulsa created a spike in demand for domestic help, which enabled black residents to attain high-paying labor jobs as maids, chauffeurs, gardeners, janitors, shoe shiners, and porters. These workers often earned enough money to send their children to universities like Columbia Law School, Oberlin College, the Hampton Institute, the Tuskegee Institute, Spelman College, and Atlanta University, which positioned them to secure white-collar jobs after graduation. Now, I do want to note here that it should be acknowledged that some of the black wealth that built Greenwood did not come from those reparative land grants after slavery, but rather from later federal policies seizing back and redistributing land from the indigenous nations that had received it as part of the forced resettlement in the Trail of Tears. In 1889, after a decade of lobbying by the railroad industry, including funding a PR campaign to promote illegal settlement in Oklahoma, the federal government opened 2 million acres of these lands to new settlers in the first land rush. While the settlers were mostly white, there were some black settlers from other parts of the country who saw an opportunity to become landowners too, and some of these were among the founders of Tulsa's Greenwood neighborhood later on, having translated those land expropriations into enough seed money to become commercial entrepreneurs, real estate developers, and financial lenders. And that is coming to us again from that History Channel article. And you can also find out more about this sort of process of the land grants and land rushes with the Wikipedia articles on unassigned lands and the land rush of 1889. Now, one thing that I think is also worth discussing is, again, what the effects of that money circulating within the black community and only within the black community in Tulsa were. So we've talked on some previous episodes about this, that this was a common feature in heavily segregated areas, including in some parts of the broader American South, like the Deep South and so forth, as well as some of the sort of more border areas, and even in some of the more segregated communities in the northern United States, in the urban areas. Essentially, if you had a concentrated enough and segregated off enough sort of business district and residential district and so forth, as that Investopedia essay talked about, you would get this circulation effect where the money multiplier effect is happening as people spend their dollars within this one community. The dollars don't leak out of that community, and it keeps sort of recirculating through. However, it's not like it was just endlessly circulating and everyone was benefiting in some sort of really equitable way. There was actually a great deal of inequality and stratification within the black community in Tulsa. And unsurprisingly, the capital-owning class of black residents tended to be the biggest beneficiary of these segregation economics. And there's a section I wanted to quote from the History Channel article. Although wealthy black people lived in Greenwood, plenty still struggled, working menial jobs and living in shanties. But the money they spent in the district helped build the community. Quote, people working outside the district, particularly the domestics, the housekeepers, cooks, nannies, or the ushers at the magnificent Art Deco theaters or bellhops at the great hotels, would get paid and then return to Greenwood with their money, said Michelle Place, executive director of the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum. Quote, with segregation, they can't spend their money anywhere else. They can make their money out of the district, but they can't spend it there, end quote. So again, I want to highlight that while you will often hear this referred to as Black Wall Street and the emphasis on the richer black residents and all the big businesses that they built and everything, it should be emphasized that not everyone was benefiting equally from this sort of oil boom money, and the people who had tended to already have seed money on hand from before the oil boom were the ones best positioned to take advantage of this by sort of accumulating the profits vertically up toward them within this black neighborhood, and the people who were at the bottom were sort of funneling money into this, which again, then did translate into things like lending and so forth for building other businesses and that kind of thing. But again, there were people who were living in shanties in this area as well. So it's not completely cut and dried that this was just this spectacularly wealthy neighborhood of all rich black people, and that this generated all kinds of resentments to the nearby poor whites and also rich and middle class whites of the broader area of Tulsa. So, Rachel, before we move on from that, I wondered if you had any sort of thoughts about the sort of material factors that we've discussed today about the rise of Tulsa's Greenwood neighborhood.
Yeah, I guess I didn't realize that Oklahoma didn't become a state until so late in our country's history. It's later than a lot of the states that are west of Oklahoma. So I was actually really surprised. You kind of imagine statehood happening in this westward wave, but that just wasn't the case due to those unique circumstances where the Native Americans were just kind of ushered to this territory. And I think it's really interesting to note that Reconstruction happened in a different way to white people versus those Native Americans. It was a lot more, I guess, acceptable to take land and resources from the Native Americans that just didn't happen to the other slaveholding areas and to the white communities. There just wasn't that land seizure or that forced, I guess, like forced reparations to the freedmen happening. And so that really puts a unique spin on the conditions for freedmen in Oklahoma versus freedmen in other areas.
Now, there is a lot of the historians quoted in some of these pieces, like the Associated Press article in particular, sort of contend or imply that this is a demonstration. What happened in the Greenwood neighborhood is a demonstration of what probably would have happened in other parts of the country if there had been significant sort of land grants and reparations without extensive protection on an ongoing basis by federal troops. Now, I think some people might counter-argue that and say, well, what they should have done was also do land redistribution to a lot of the poor white farmers in the American South, and that would have smoothed things over substantially, and that the basis is the same as the taking land or forcing land grants to freed slaves in the Indian territories also should have happened in the Confederacy itself, right? They were getting punished because they had supported the Confederacy more than the actual Confederates were being punished. Those giant capitalist, agro-capitalist plantation owners should have had their lands seized and divided up among not only the freed slaves, but also poor whites who had largely supported unionism during the Civil War period itself, and that this should have just been their punishment for having supported this insurrection, was to have all of their land divvied up and so forth. But we, of course, know that that is not what happened during Reconstruction, and you have the first Klan period where there's extensive terror campaigns, and that was sort of broken up by the Grant administration and extensive federal presence, but then eventually the federal troops were withdrawn. However, as listeners probably also know, there is another important thing to talk about, which is the second period of the Klan in the United States, and that is also a hugely important factor in what happened in the Greenwood neighborhood in May and June of 1921. So the Birth of a Nation movie came out during the Wilson administration years. Huge sensation, rekindles the popularity of the Klan. There's this, basically the new Klan is formed. And as we've talked about on many, many previous episodes, this becomes this enormous feature of American life for a few years in the late 1910s and into the 1920s. They become very important in Democratic Party politics, and in some cases in certain areas of the country, like in parts of the North that were heavily Republican, they also get involved in Republican politics. Now, we've talked about things like the Klan's clashes with the IWW in, the 1920s in like the San Pedro Maritime Strike and so forth. But you can't talk about the race riot, quote unquote, or really more properly, the massacre, looting, and complete arson of this huge black neighborhood in Tulsa without talking about the Klan And here again, we see an important feature of Oklahoma history specifically, I think. And that, Rachel, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about that because it relates back to another previous episode of ours and kind of emphasizes that the Klan was powerful and some of the potential countervailing forces were not anymore.
Right. So we covered the Green Corn Rebellion of 1917 in our Lend-Lease miniseries, episode 15, in December of 2019. And so just to kind of recap, there was a lot of organization happening at that time because tenant farmers, both black and white, were being squeezed by the landowners that they were renting their farmland from, forcing them to take on ever-increasing debt. And so the Socialist Party and the Working Class Union, as well as the IWW, were able to organize the tenant farmers in opposition to rent seeking by the landowners, and also in the greater picture, the Great War. Quoting from our sources at that time, the country folk had no intention of allowing President Woodrow Wilson and his agents in the county seats to send them to die in France. So they were fighting against what they perceived as the elites just sending them off to die for no reason. And so when they rose up and rebelled against the draft, they had no quarrel with the Germans. A posse was formed to crush the rebellion. And that really led to a backlash against the Socialist Party and other pro-worker, multiracial movements happening in that area. So the Ku Klux Klan was able to use this anti-union, anti-worker sentiment to recruit. And so then the number of cross burnings and other terrorist acts grew in number and severity. And so there really wasn't any force that was organized enough to rise up against the Ku Klux Klan, and also fighting against the racial tensions that were happening at this time, as well as the just general clamping down on free speech or freedom of movement, really. So there was a lot of suspicion of your neighbors happening at that time, and I think all those factors just kind of coalesced to spark the conditions that led to this massacre.
I also suspect that the state government and local authorities were probably much more willing to immediately deploy huge amounts of semi-public, semi-private force in light of the fact that they had brutally suppressed the Green Corn Rebellion just a few years earlier. I mean, we're talking about 3 or 4 years earlier, basically. And in many cases, those folks had been white tenant farmers that were resisting, and just a total willingness to immediately go to extreme lengths to put down any sort of thing that they viewed as a threat to their order, their preferred order of things. I think, as you said, it's a lot of factors combining together, but I think that is another sort of unique aspect of the situation in Oklahoma at the time that is worth understanding. Now, as Rachel said earlier, it's never been completely figured out what the final death toll of this action, which is often referred to as a pogrom, because that is sort of the most similar thing. I mean, this was much, much bigger in scale than a typical sort of lynching session would have been. And that was, of course, another thing that was happening all over the country at the time, as we've talked about in previous episodes. But this is similar to, say, the Russian pogroms against Jewish communities, which is that a whole bunch of private citizens and in combination with troops show up. They burn down the entire neighborhood to the ground and kill some unknown number of people, and then temporarily detain the survivors for an extended period before potentially releasing them. So it's I think a relatively fair comparison to make at the time, and it's unclear, as Rachel said, about how many people actually died. The estimates are that as many as 300 people may have died. Now, earlier we talked about at a couple points we quoted from the Museum and Historical Society in Tulsa, and they have a big sort of feature on this. But the city government itself also has an enormous number of resources that you can check out about this. As we said, there was a 2001 sort of state commission report on this, these events timed for the 80th anniversary, and that was mostly sort of a fact-finding thing. But as there's obviously been a significant number of periods of widespread racial unrest in this country in the past several years. The focus has been renewed again and again on the incidents of 1921 in Greenwood. And the result of this is that the city of Tulsa's government has decided to pursue formal investigations of not only the facts of what happened, which were already mostly ascertained in the 2001 commission report, but also trying to sort of find potential mass grave sites or find out what happened to the bodies, whether they were dumped in the river or not, or maybe they were just completely burned. And this has involved all sorts of forensic processes, working with various universities and so forth, and is obviously a very sensitive topic. Since 2018, they've been investigating possible unmarked grave sites of those killed in the massacre of 1921, and they are marking the centennial this coming week by beginning to very carefully exhume some of these grave sites for DNA identification work. And they've been doing all sorts of sort of subground scanning and things like that before they start the exhumation process. And they're going to try to, if there are indeed bodies, they're going to confirm that they are connected to this 1921 massacre, and also hopefully link them to surviving family members, which there are a lot of surviving family members. I mean, as we talked about earlier, thousands of people were temporarily detained for about a week following this event, and many of them were living in a sort of tent city on the former site of this neighborhood for a long time, and they never really, they tried in many cases to rebuild this neighborhood, basically unsuccessfully, as the community was not supporting this rebuilding effort. And many of the folks either dispersed to other parts of the country or are still living in other parts of Tulsa today. And so there are many surviving relatives of people who remembered, the events of 1921, were eyewitnesses to it and survived it. But they, lost family members or never heard from family members again as well. And so they might be able to match those people. So Rachel, anything else that we need to cover before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that there is this video essay on YouTube, and they're highlighting that survivors and descendants of the Tulsa Race Massacre are still seeking justice and damages for what happened in 1921, and they've actually filed a lawsuit against Tulsa. There's some congressional testimony included in this video, and in these testimonials, they describe how they've been previously brushed off by both the state of Oklahoma and the federal government in their search for justice. So it's really impressive. These survivors are over 100 years old, obviously, and they're still seeking justice. So it's crazy to think about that they haven't been restituted in any meaningful way by anybody, and they've just kind of been continually brushed off, and the massacre has been swept under the rug for the most part until this kind of more recent reckoning with our past history and what happened in 1921.
Now, there's a lot of material that we obviously didn't cover today, both for time reasons and to sort of differentiate our coverage of this. I encourage people to check out various articles, documentaries. I'm sure there's lots of podcast episodes on other shows that talk more through some of these eyewitness accounts of what happened at the time. And there's a lot of really interesting details, especially around like the aerial bombardment by planes and so forth, which was denied for a long time, even though many eyewitness reports had various accounts that seemed to suggest that planes, were following the World War I model of flying around and dropping things over the side or shooting out of them with rifles and so forth. But we decided to focus this week on the economic conditions leading up to these events and the conditions within Tulsa and Greenwood itself, and why the situation there was so different from so many other parts of the United States at the time. So, Rachel, thanks for coming on this week to talk about the events 100 years ago this week in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Thanks for having me, Bill.